genus I'm looking at, or distinguish the species within that. So, time for the first quiz. Let's test our memory of the names of these information points on other grass florets. Within the Poaceae, I'm not going to throw curveballs at you folks. So let's take a look at this first one. Again, we've got the Kentucky bluegrass, and just kind of discuss, again, we're just going to go a bit peppy with this first question, and I'll just see what you folks, what's number 1, what's number 2, what's number 3 arrow pointing at, and what is the number 4. Remember, I'm talking about 4 information points. Number 1 is our lemma, the biggest one that stands out. Number 2 points to the palea, where those marginal teeth along the, meaning teeth along the edges, are important for us when we're looking at this subfamily. Number 3 is our stalk-like rachilla, which attaches to other florets at number 4, which is the callus. Let's take a look at orchard grass. Okay. Number 1 is the palea. Number 2, it's the lemma. Number 3, pointing to the base of the floret, it is the callus. And number 4 is our good friend, the stalk-like rachilla. One more. Let's take a look at a brome. We've got our cheat here. Let's see. Number 1 is pointing that kind of door knocker curved stalk at the base of the palea. That's our rachilla. Number 2, that's the callus. Number 3, my gosh, you can see those teeth along the edges just sticking out at you. Yeah, that's the palea. And of course, what we have left in our information points is number 4, which is the lemma. All right, so let's get to the 3 groups we'll be looking at today, which will be the wheatgrasses, just as a general group, the fescues, and the ryegrasses, including a couple of look-alike species. So let's take a look at the 4 information points on these 3 groups of classes, and they roughly cover 4 genera within these 3 groups. This is how this will be structured. So let's take a look at size. I know it's not, I didn't mention it as an information point, but I'm trying to think of, especially as beginner analysts, what jumps out at you if this was to occur in your sample. And if you were looking at a wheatgrass, a fescue, and a ryegrass, are there some larger distinguishing features? And to me, that's size. So to me, the wheatgrasses are the longest. Fescues and ryegrasses are a bit the same size, but ryegrasses tend to look more stout to me, or the lemma is quite a bit wider. And we're looking at the lemma view right now, of course. So at the lemmas, what stands out to you? Now, for me, the left-hand species in each of the groups, so that means we've got the left hand of this pair, the left-hand one of this pair, and of course this little ryegrass hanging out by himself. The lemmas have a sheen or a shine to them. So I'm going to be referring to these as a shining lemma. Oftentimes that means they're smooth. They don't have a lot of texture or hairs on them, so the light reflects back. That's really, really important and a quick thing that you folks can see. Now, most of the lemmas have awns, and those awns are stout in the wheat and the ryegrass group. Now, look at the bottom of the lemmas, right above that callus, and you'll see that there's a line at the base in all but the wheatgrass on the left and the ryegrass. That's referred to a keel. It's like a folding in the back of the lemma, and it's important in distinguishing. Now, that left wheatgrass, or wheatgrass look-alike, has a bump at the base of the lemma, important. Now, left-hand fescue, I can see that green shining through. Now, that's telling me that the lemma is thin. And all the other lemmas, they look thicker, and all the ones on the right-hand side of the fescues and wheatgrasses are dull. Let's take a look at the callus. What stands out? I see that it's prominent in the wheatgrasses, thinner in the fescue to the right and in the ryegrass. The space above the callus is important, and it's big in one of the wheatgrasses to the right, in the right-hand fescue, and in the ryegrass. Okay, lemmas. My wireless mouse just ran away on me. Sorry about that. All right. Let's take a look at the Poaceae now, our second information point, as well as another view of the calyces, and we get to see our rachillas now. What stands out to you about the Poaceae? To me, one of the big things is how much the lemma folds in, whether the Poaceae is dull or shiny, whether it's thick or thin, that is, if you can see the grain or not. Now, we can't really see the teeth of the edges of the Poaceae, but it is a very important feature, again, as I've mentioned, of the subfamily. We'll see some close-up pictures later. At the base, there's another view of the callus. Now, notice how the callus of the two fescue species on the right there, how it flares out at the side. And it may be a little bit tough to see, but it's like it bumps out at either side. That's important. Also see that the callus of those wheatgrasses are tipped forward, so you can see that attachment scar. The shape of that will be important, especially in that group. Also notice that that callus base tends to be flat in the fescue, that lone fescue on the right-hand side, and on the two ryegrass species. That distinction will come in important later. Now, the rachilla is prominent in all of the Poaceae and is used, obviously, as I said, as an information point. The shape of it stands out the most to me. The length can be a feature, but it tends to be really variable depending where that floret was in that little alternating stack that I showed that diagram of at the beginning of the webinar. I'm noticing that wheatgrasses and ryegrasses have a thick rachilla. The fescues have thin ones. Both those ryegrasses and that one fescue to the right have rather flat rachillas, meaning squished, flat two-dimensionally. This feature plus that flat callus base is an important similarity and one of the reasons why that fescue and ryegrasses their features can overlap on the information points and they can be confusing. One more thing, take a look at the rachillas on the wheatgrasses at the base. Some folks call it the sinus, and the shape of the rachilla at the base, how it looks to you, is important. The wheatgrass or the wheatgrass look-alike on the left-hand side has a U shape at the base, while the one on the right has a V shape. Also look at the shape. The wheatgrass rachilla on the left-hand side is parallel-sided, while the one on the right is wedge-shaped. Now, let's take but a moment, and those of you that have had some experience with grasses, understanding maybe not the folks in the course today, or those folks that are just dang brave, jot down right now what species you think each of these are. Now, it's not important for this webinar. I just want to kind of give some other folks a challenge here. They will be common, crop, and weed species. And it's Monday morning, so I'm not going to make music noise, but yeah, I can hear whispering. I love this part. Okay, I'll give you folks about 10 more seconds. Nine and 10, and here we go, big reveal. All right. I thought I heard a yay back there. I'm not too sure. Right on. You guys are brave. This is, like I say, not only am I talking about grasses, but this is an introductory course, so good on you folks. All right, you'll be seeing these guys in detail in the next few slides. Let's go on to the wheatgrasses. There will be two that we'll be looking at, which will be western wheatgrass and its look-alike couchgrass, two species that are often confused. So right now we have a lemma view and a Poaceae view. So we should see all four of those information points. And just let me talk about those. For each of these groups, I'll be the ryegrasses, the fescues, and the wheatgrasses. I'll introduce the features of those four information points. Now, as I describe them, take a look at the slide and see if you can spot what I'm describing. Some features you can't see on the slide, and I'll give some close-ups when I can. And at the end of each section, I will present those features in a comparison table. And also, of course, as I love to do, a short quiz. Oh, well, now I'm just going to stop. Let me do this. All right, here we go again. Now, so the lemma on the western wheatgrass is dull. There's a groove above the callus, so it almost looks like someone put their thumbnail in there. Very distinctive feature for that information point. The lemma on the couchgrass is smooth and shiny, and there's a shiny bump at the base of the lemma. Again, very important. The palea of western wheatgrass, again, is dull. It's usually short hairy. Again, you can't see it here, but it does make it look dull. The teeth along the palea side, you could just see hints of them along the right-hand upper edge. They're mixed, long, and short teeth, and they're packed close together. The palea on, couchgrass is smooth, shining. The palea teeth are distinctively coarse and widely spaced, and some analysts have described them as shark-like teeth. The rachilla down in western wheatgrass is wedge-shaped, as I mentioned earlier. It's short, hairy, or smooth. The sinus at the base, the shape at the base is usually V-shaped. And the rachilla in couchgrass is parallel sides, smooth, and the base, the shape of the base is U-shaped. The callus of western wheatgrass, now on the back of it, which you can't see in this picture, but hopefully take my word for it, there are a line of hairs with a break in the middle, kind of like a mustache. And the scar, which you can see because the callus in these folks are tipped forward, it is triangular. The callus on couchgrass is smooth, clean-shaven, if we want to continue that, and the scar is an oval scar. So let's take a look at that close-up of the palea teeth, which are important in the wheatgrass group, and also important to distinguish species of other wheatgrasses. Yes, you folks in the course, there are other wheatgrasses, but I will just introduce you to these two. We'll start you slow. So as you can see, the palea on western wheatgrass, you can't see the hairiness, but you sure dang well can see the teeth. This particular example has extra long teeth. That's why I chose it for the picture. Oftentimes they will not be this long, but they will be long and short mixed. And then the teeth on the couchgrass, they look thin, but that's only because they are clear. The ones on the left-hand side near the base of those are quite thick. They're like two of the western wheatgrass teeth smooshed together. They are thick, distinctive as all get out. Here's our first comparison table. We're going to leave the wheatgrasses soon. So all of those things that I've mentioned are described here in the comparison table. And you see the lemma, dull versus smooth, groove versus bump, palea, those teeth are the biggest giveaway. Concentrate on those when you're trying to distinguish these species. The rachilla, concentrate on the shape. The sinus at the base is a pretty good feature, but depending on damage and where they were on that floret stack, you may not get the shape that you would like, but the sinus shape, but the shape of the rachilla holds true. And the callus, those lines of hairs, you need some pretty big magnification. And the scar shape, again, can be a little bit variable, but with all of these put together, you folks should have no problem with your practicing. So just give a few more seconds. Just jot down those major things: groove versus bump, dull versus smooth, teeth, shape of the rachilla, and callus. There's a few features that are pretty good to tell them apart. All right, let's go on to our first question. Which wheatgrass has a parallel-sided rachilla and no hairs across the callus? Remember I said that was clean-shaven. You have 50-50 chance, but I know you folks have picked up everything. Couchgrass or western wheatgrass? Couchgrass. It is the couchgrass. Parallel-sided rachilla, no hairs across the callus, clean-shaven. Second question, which wheatgrass is this? Let's take a look at our information points. Those palea teeth stand out. They look kind of long and short mixed together, closely packed. And that wedge-shaped rachilla definitely stands out to me. And overall dull looking. Yeah.
Wheatgrass.
Western wheatgrass, right on. All right. Okay, moving along. Fescue species. This time, we have 3 we're going to look at that were requested to distinguish. We've got our red fescue, so I'm just going to call it red. I'm not going to distinguish between red and creeping red for this purposes of this webinar. And also going to look at tall fescue as well as meadow fescue. So let's look at the palea and lemma views, and you folks have seen these at the beginning. Notice red fescue, the palea and lemma views are switched, but no problem. So for me, the thing that stands out about the lemma and also somewhat the palea is the color, the quality, whether it's dull or shining, and the thick or the thinness of it. And that's important in the fescues. Notice I didn't mention that in the wheatgrasses, so it's not quite as important within the wheatgrass group there, or look-alike species. So for the red fescue, the lemma is pale, thin, shining. It's also awned at the top. And by the way, the awn is a bristle that occurs in quite a few lemmas of grass florets. It's often used to catch on to the hairs of passing animals or to drill in the case of wild oats or sterile oats. Definitely changes and makes a floret stay close to the ground so that it can get some good water. All right. The thing about red fescue lemma that you can't see here is that it's often bent backwards. So bent sway back away from the lemma. The lemma in tall fescue, the next one, is dark, dull, and thick. What you may or may not be able to see here is that it is granular, meaning that there are little tiny minute warts or bumps regularly scattered all over the lemma and the palea. And hopefully you'll be able to take a look at some tall fescue. If not in this course, then back at your labs, and we'll be able to see this for yourself. The lemma of the meadow fescue is dark as well, thick. This time it's shining. It's quite smooth, not granular. The teeth specifically, now I don't actually look at the teeth quality of that information point for fescues, only for wheatgrass and lookalikes. But interestingly on meadow fescue, the teeth are not really visible. They're visible on the other two, not visible, and they're a little bit unevenly distributed. So that's an important point for me, especially to tell apart meadow and tall. Rachilla on the red fescue is delicate. It's also hairy. Now, I'm right next to the slide so I can see it. You can see the hair sticking out, and I believe I do have a close-up so you can see that a bit better. The rachilla on the tall fescue is capped. You can see that rim around the top of it. That comes in important. It's hairy as well. Now the rachilla on the meadow fescue, notice it's a bit thicker, but it's also capped. It's smooth, not hairy, kind of in line with the lemma and the palea, and it curves outwards. That's another really important feature to take a look at. The callus of fescues are quite important. You'll notice the callus at the base of the red fescue is not flared at the sides. It's quite rounded. There's a space. If you look at the lemma view, you'll see above the callus there is a space. There's that gap there. That's important in distinguishing the fescues. Let's take a look at the callus of tall fescue. This is one that has flares, or it has, the sides are expanded. The base is rounded, and there's quite a large, like a gape or a gap above the callus. Important. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a back callus view of meadow fescue, so hopefully you'll take my word for it and do some fact-checking when you get some meadow fescue back at your labs. But it is also flared at the sides. But this time it has a flat base, not a rounded base, and there's a small space above, not a large space. Now, I'm talking about these in particular because meadow fescue and tall fescue are often mixed up, also by yours truly. So I'm just giving you some points that really helped me to distinguish them. But of course, this webinar, again, is not going to make you experts. I wish. It is going to give you some points to start from so that you can practice and also find language that works for you. So let's take a look at the comparison table before we leave the fescues and go on to our wonderful quizzes. Now, the thing I said about the lemma's red fescue, the color stands out when distinguishing red fescue from the other two. And there are some, such as sheep and hard, that definitely you folks will be exposed to over time. But just between this red fescue, it stands out from all the others because it is pale. The shining of it definitely sets it apart from tall, and it is awned. And the other thing about red fescue, it's rather a delicate floret, and it's often curved backwards when it's mature, such as what you see as a crop species. Now, the tall fescue lemma is quite dark colored. Oh, that's the other thing. You can see the grain, as I've mentioned, through the back of red fescue. That very dark purple grain is another hallmark of red fescue. And also I'll mention at this time that sometimes, not as many times as I would like to tell them apart, but there can be a purple wash. You can see it right at the top of the rachilla of this particular picture. So oftentimes on the rachilla and the base of the lemma, there is a purpley color. Call it a wash. It's kind of indistinct, but it can, believe me, every little bit helps with these grasses. Now, on to tall fescue lemma. Dark, dull, thick. If you take a close-up look, you can see all of those tiny little dots, very rough sandpapery if you touched it with your finger. And it is so granular, is what I call like grains of sugar or grains of sand. And it is awned as well at the back. Now, meadow fescue, again, dark, thick. This time it's shining, it's smooth, not granular. And I didn't mention before, but there is an awn at the top. There can be a small one, and there tends to be none. Hanging all of your identification hats on whether there's an awn or not really isn't a good idea in the fescues, but I thought I'd mention it just to tell you all the features of that information point. Next, flipping it over, looking at the palea. Red fescue, of course, like the lemma, pale, shining. You can see that really purple grain through it. Can have a bit of a purple wash. Now, interestingly, there's hairs at the top of it, though, of that palea. The teeth are visible. Again, not telling you about the quality of that feature, just to let you know if they're visible or not. Important in those fescues. Taking a look at the tall fescue palea, something I noticed that maybe didn't come across on the picture so well. You can see it at the base. The tall fescue to me, again, this is me, the palea looks wrinkled, kind of almost accordion folded. That's just a little tip, may not be something that holds true depending where it's grown, but stands out to me. That granular I talked about, and the teeth again are visible. Now the meadow fescue palea is shining, not granular, it's smooth, and the teeth are not obvious. Two things that tells it apart right away from tall fescue, if you were to take a close-up look. The rachilla red fescue, delicate, thin, long, it's hairy, and it protrudes, so meaning it stands away. You could see it in a side view a bit better. You could see a little bit of the grain underneath, or pardon me, the palea underneath. So it stands away from the palea. The rachilla tall fescue is capped. It has that flat top, and it's hairy. The meadow fescue is also capped, and it's smooth. Now, I don't have in this comparison table, it's a bit wider. That comes important in the next section, and it curves away. So it doesn't, like the red fescue just kind of stands away. The meadow fescue actually curves. The bottom half curves away from the palea. The callus is not flared at the sides. Oh, yeah, so the callus and those qualities of the lemma and palea are important because when you're taking a look at a crop species, especially to see if there are other crop fescues mixed in or fescues that weren't part of the declared mixture mixed in, you're not going to be able to look at those two, well, granular you may, or visible teeth versus teeth not obvious. I mean, you can't really microscopically look at every one of those. I understand that. So taking a look at the shape, the callus shape and the space are two that stand out to me that you can train your eyes as you go through the crop. So in red fescue, I mean, the pale and thin should stand out already, but looking at the callus, it's not flared at the sides, and there's a small space above. Tall fescue is indeed flared at the sides. It has a rounded base and a huge gap, well, I mean relatively huge compared to the other species above. Meadow fescue, also flared at the sides. This time it has a flat base and a small space above. So a lot of folks turn it over and look at the lemma and get a lot of information, especially between tall and meadow fescue. All right, so for me, I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a quiz. So what I have here, the little, not quite an essay, let's say short answer. I did all that talking and description. I would like you folks now to write down, without that comparison table in front of you, using your own words, describing the features of 3 information points, which is the palea, the rachilla, and the callus, at least the callus on the palea side, of these 2 fescues. And I've given you the name of them. So at this time, I'd like to also point out the granular palea. So you can see on this close-up picture on the right-hand side what I mean by granular. And that's a descriptive term. You folks can use, I can't think of it, but many other terms, or even it looks like sandpaper. I mean, there's no, you don't have to stick with a certain term, especially when you make grass identification your own. So I really encourage you, use what I say as a starting point, gather the information from your own interpretation and from other analysts. They are such a font of information. It's incredible. So what words would you use to distinguish? That means we're going to compare and contrast between red fescue and tall fescue. The palea, the rachilla, and the callus of these 2.
Protruding in breakfast.
So for the palea, you know, if these were in a sample, just came across while I was spiking, what really stands out to me is the color. So one's pale, the other is dark colored. Also the quality of the palea, smooth and shining versus granular or sandpapery. I think that's what stands out from what I can see of the Poaceae here. And just as a pointing out the, this isn't a distinguishing feature, but again, I went through the first part a little bit quick. I just wanted to point out the lemma that folds over the Poaceae. So you've got your lemma ending on the red fescue, about a quarter of the way into the picture. Just not sure if you folks can see my mouse arrow or not, so I'm trying to give descriptive words too. And then you can see the Poaceae as well, and it kind of dips down right in the middle. And then you can see the lemma folding over, kind of almost a V shape from the base. So anyway, the Poaceae, color, thickness, smooth versus granular. The Rachilla, both of they're hairy on both. You can see a purple at the top, really stands out in this picture, but not going to be in every one of your specimens. The Rachilla is kind of thin and straight. There should be a cap. It is a fescue, but you know, depending on how it was ripped away from the callus, you may or may not be able to see it. But tall fescue seems to have a very, this is across the board, seems to have a really well-developed cap at the top. And you can't see it with a front view, but hopefully fact check me that the the Rachilla of red fescue stands away from the Poaceae, while the Rachilla of tall fescue nestles in between the lemma and rests on the Poaceae there. And finally, the callus. And it's a bit hard at the close-up because tall fescue is rather pale at the base. But the sides of tall fescue tend to have bumps at the, the callus of tall fescue tends to have bumps at the sides. We call it flaring out at the sides. A similarity between the two is that they're both rounded at the base. Red fescue does not have the flaring sides. And that's what I'd say about that. Now, you can't see the back of it to compare the gap at the back between the callus and the lemma, but you saw from the other pictures that tall fescue has quite a big gap at the base. As you can see, I just flipped back a couple of slides there. I've got one more question. Question the 7. Which fescue of the 3 we've looked at has a dark, shining lemma, a Poaceae without obvious teeth, and a flat callus base? Does flare at the sides, but it's flat at the base. Is it red fescue, tall fescue, or meadow fescue?
Red.
It is, believe it or not, meadow fescue. Yeah. All right. This is our last section. Oh, hope you folks are holding up. It is, grasses are quite a thing, and you're doing great. All right. I know you are. I can't see you, but I know you are. All right. So I'm going to take a look at annual ryegrasses and perennial ryegrasses. And there's also a look-alike species that I have been vaguely or obviously hinting at throughout this whole webinar, and I'll be including that species near the end. Okay, so annual and perennial, my gosh, this whole annual versus perennial, I don't know, it sounds like a fight club or something. I have heard different ways to tell these apart. Their information, they overlap strongly, and I believe that they're often mixed together. I'm not sure if there's unless you have both of them together in a sample, it's kind of very hard to tell whether you have one or the other, especially if it comes in as an impurity, not a crop. And it often comes in as an impurity. I'm going to do my best. Just know that those of you that are looking at annual versus perennial are going down a dark and winding path of distinguishing. And if you do come upon some really great ways to tell them apart, please share them. We do need more information. Folks have been looking at if the seedlings fluoresce, and it's anyway, it's wild and woolly. Let's try our best. All right, annual versus perennial. You'll notice that the perennial ryegrass to the right there does not have a lemma view. Sorry about that. Again, I'll give you some words. Please fact check me. All right. All right, thing I notice about annual ryegrass is that it's often awned, and the awn is quite thin. Believe me, when it comes in as an impurity or has been processed, that awn can break off. That's why I'm mentioning it, but not, again, as I said, not hanging my hat on it. I mean, I wish they came in as perfect specimens. They don't. So the awn often, I'm just going to mention it, but it's, yeah, it's not always presented as an intact feature. The lemma to me is looks thin. Now you can't see it because I don't have a side view, but it is often curved backwards, much as I described the red fescue, bowed back. In perennial ryegrass, the awn is usually not present, and it has more of a stout appearance. Notice that I'm now talking about stout versus thin, which are quite subjective terms. I did give my disclaimer that these are quite difficult to distinguish. Looking at the Poaceae, and I've been looking at that Poaceae under a microscope lately. Now, the interesting thing about the Poaceae within the ryegrasses is that they are both smooth and granular. So they're smooth at the top of the Poaceae, and they start getting sandpapery as you move towards the base. I'm just going to give you a nitpicky thing. Again, going to just try to give you all the words I can. Poaceae in annual ryegrass is usually shining above and granular close to the rachilla. Notice in this one behaves for me in that the Poaceae is often flared at the top of annual ryegrass. See how it opens up and the lemma kind of pulls away and just kind of meets it, doesn't fold over, like you see here in the perennial ryegrass. In the perennial ryegrass, it is shining above and can be more gradually granular towards the bottom half. So I believe what I'm saying is that in annual, it's granular quite abruptly, and then in perennial, it's more of a gradual feature. Again, pretty nitpicky, and you're only going to see that under a microscope. Notice I'm not mentioning the teeth of the Poaceae. I have tried, because believe me, Poaceae teeth in the Poaceae are often a really good information point to distinguish, and I can't use the Poaceae teeth to distinguish between the two myself. They tend to have Poaceae teeth at the top, and it tends to peter out near the base. You know, if you folks can find something, let me know. Anyway, the rachilla. So notice just generally for the ryegrasses, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning, that the rachillas are flat. So they're flattened. If you were to take a cross-section, it would be an oval rather than a circle, is what I mean by flattened, squished towards the Poaceae. Slightly capped, but they tend to be straight-sided. Notice something about the rachilla between these two, especially near the base. In annual ryegrass, it's straight-sided all the way to the base and can be curved outwards. Perennial ryegrass, it often tapers toward the base, but look how tiny of a difference that is, and it also tends to lie flat against the Poaceae. Looking at the callus, both of them have a flat base, and remember I said something about maybe another grass in the group previous that has a flat base. So the thing to distinguish these two species, so ryegrasses, loliums will have a flat base, flat rachilla. Between annual and perennial, annual is said to have a space above the callus, a bit of a big space, while you're going to have to fact check me because we don't have a lemma view. There is little to no space above the callus in perennial ryegrass. So let's take a look. I believe next is going to be the comparison table. So I'm going to give you folks some words here. And oh my gosh, there's a third species I've snuck in. That is the fescue, at least in my eyes, that's most often mistaken for a lolium. When I started out, of course it never happens now, but when I started out, I was stumped because I couldn't fit this Festuca pratensis into a lolium, and then I took a look at some distinguishing features and realized I was looking at a fescue. So that comes down in the callus and the rachilla, but let's look at the lemma first. So I said on versus not on. Remember, this is not going to be a primary feature because of cleaning. Thin appearance, so narrow, and the back is often arched. The lemma in perennial ryegrass tends to be not awned, and it's stout, it's wide. That is, if you have annual and perennial side by side. And then meadow fescue is not awned. The Poaceae in annual ryegrass tends to be abrupt, shining at the top, to granular near the rachilla. The teeth are obvious. That's only important when we're distinguishing that from its fescue look-alike. And the Poaceae tends to be flared at the top. It opens up at the top. In perennial ryegrass, it tends to have a gradual shining at the top, smooth to granular towards the base, and the teeth, again, are obvious. Meadow fescue, it's shining all the way through, no sandpapery texture on your Poaceae, and the teeth are not obvious. So if you had a microscope, you could tell ryegrass from meadow fescue, but there's easier ways. In the rachilla, straight-sided, flat, tends to curve away from the Poaceae. Again, depending on where it was in that floret stack, you may not see that. Rachilla for me in perennial ryegrass tends to taper towards the base, is flat, of course, and lays flat. Meadow fescue is where I finally distinguished I was looking at a fescue, not a lolium, because it is rounded, and it is capped, and it curves outward. So in annual ryegrass, the callus, of course, is not flared, and that's to distinguish it from a fescue. And that flaring, you can often see those bumps at the sides are better seen from a lemma view, that back view of the floret. There is a space above the callus, and in perennial ryegrass, there tends to be no space above. And in meadow fescue, it is flared at the sides, flat base, which makes it look like a lolium, and there's a space above. Whew. Lots of words, lots of comparison tables. I'm really excited for you folks to use these tools and make them your own. Let's take a look at question number 8. Hey, here's a question. Which fescue can be mistaken for a ryegrass? And I'm going to make it a bit tougher. I'm going to ask you 3 ways that they can be distinguished. So we're nearing the end here. I see I've kind of run into some time, so I'm just going to do a few minutes here, or pardon me, a minute here. So yeah, your distinguishing features are really, there's one about the Poaceae teeth, tough to see in these pictures, but that rachilla and base really stand out. And the ryegrass to the side is a perennial. That probably doesn't matter. Okay, so of course meadow fescue can be mistaken for ryegrass. So what are some ways that they could be distinguished from each other? All right, so you got your rachilla and your callus. Okay, I'm going to give you folks a few more seconds, and I'm going to put the answers up. All right, just let you finish up there, and we'll take a look at what I found. So the Poaceae, meadow fescue, smooth all the way through. Ryegrass is granular towards the base. Doesn't matter, annual or perennial. I'm just talking about ryegrasses in general. The rachilla, meadow fescue, the one to the left there, is rounded and capped. Now, what I mean by rounded is rounded compared to a lolium, compared to a ryegrass. If you're just comparing fescue to fescue, meadow fescue's rachilla tends to be wide and a bit more oval-shaped in cross-section than, let's say, your red fescue, which you saw before, that very delicate rachilla. but that capping does come through and you can see it. You can see a bit of a rim on the perennial ryegrass, but when you take a close-up look at it, and again, I hope you do, it doesn't, I don't know, there's not a rim around the outside. It doesn't come out like a mushroom cap, for instance. There is a distinct break because, of course, it broke away from the callus of the floret above it as a scar, but it doesn't protrude out. And the callus, the meadow fescue, is flared on the side. So you can see in perennial ryegrass, the callus almost fits in with the lemma. There's not much distinction. While in the meadow fescue, it bumps in a bit. So that's probably also why it looks flared out at the sides, because you've got that indentation, that space right above the callus. All right, I believe I've got the last question here. Let me introduce to you Earl the dog.
Hi, sis.
Let me know why this dog is grumpy. Using the comparison table, no, I'm kidding, not using the comparison tables. Take a look at his palea teeth. So why is this dog grumpy? Summer was delayed again. I don't know about you folks, but I think a couple of weeks ago we had snow, our Easter snow, and right now we have a lot of rain, though this weekend was plus 20, so I'd say 80 and above for folks in the States. And, of course, the trees didn't really know what to do, and neither did the people. Dairy Queen knew what to do. Also, number two, this dog is grumpy because it just sat through a presentation about grasses. And, of course, I'd love everyone to say number three, the dog is grumpy because this presentation about grasses is over. All right. At the end, I want to say thank you again to the Iowa State University Seed Lab, Mike Starr, and the organizers for inviting me, trusting me, to help to introduce the world of grasses to the Purity Analysis Seed Analyst Workshop. And also I want to point out a really great tool that was developed here in Canada at www.idseed.ca. Please take a look at fact sheets for our weed seed order species and their lookalikes. And also there is a interactive key to seed families. What kind of seed do I have? Finding out what family that you have when you have a seed in hand, believe me, is the first step to identifying it. The seeds that we used for imaging came from the Canadian National Seed Herbarium, just next door to my office right here. I love that place. Any questions and comments, please send to ssts@inspection.gc.ca. I'm not sure how much time we have for questions, but I'd be happy